What draws us to the edge of the known? Why do human beings in every age keep building instruments to listen beyond hearing, to see beyond sight, to weigh what seems impossible to weigh? Perhaps it is not because we are reckless. Perhaps it is because wonder has always been stronger than certainty. Across the last century in quiet laboratories and forgotten workshops, there were moments when ordinary tools appeared to become something else. A camera seemed to catch a shimmer around living things. A scale trembled at the instant life departed. A recorder pulled voices from empty static. Again and again, someone leaned over a machine and felt that the world had briefly opened, just enough to reveal a seam beneath the surface. Some of these stories were dismissed as errors. Some were folded into rumor. Others survived only in fragments, passed from archive to archive like half-remembered dreams. And yet, what lingers is not simply the question of whether the devices worked. It is the deeper question they left behind. What kind of universe would allow such possibilities to exist even for a moment? This is not a journey about proving legends or defending every extraordinary claim. It is a journey through the human need to reach farther than our senses were built to go. Science, at its best, is not the enemy of mystery. It is the language we use to approach it carefully, humbly, knowing that each answer may widen the horizon instead of closing it. So let us begin there in the fragile space between evidence and longing, between measurement and meaning. Because sometimes the most revealing inventions are not the ones that conquer nature, but the ones that remind us how little of it we truly understand. And sometimes the unseen is not a threat at all. It is an invitation to look again. It began, as so many strange chapters do, with a darkened room and a faint blue glow. In the early 20th century, when electricity still felt half miraculous, experimenters placed hands, leaves, and coins onto photographic plates and watched light bloom where no flame could be seen. The images were soft at the edges, ringed with delicate coronas, as though ordinary objects carried a hidden weather around them. To some, these photographs suggested an unseen field flowing through all living things. A fingertip did not end where the skin ended, they thought. It faded into something brighter, more elusive, more alive. Scientists, meanwhile, pointed to moisture, pressure, voltage, and the behavior of high-frequency currents. The glow could be explained, they argued, without summoning any deeper mystery. Both views, in their own way, were trying to defend wonder. One through belief, the other through method. Yet the image itself refused to lose its power. Even when the apparatus could be described, even when the phenomenon was reduced to charge and contact, people kept staring at those luminous outlines and feeling that they were seeing more than a technical artifact. A machine had transformed touch into radiance. It had made the boundary of the body look uncertain. That uncertainty is part of what has always haunted modern life. We trust what can be measured, but we also sense that a measurement is never the whole of a thing. A pulse can be counted, heat can be mapped, electrical activity can be traced. But the experience of being alive still spills beyond the chart. The glow in those photographs, whether mystical or mundane, became a mirror for that feeling. And so the first of these inventions left behind a question larger than itself. When a device reveals a pattern we do not fully understand, what are we really seeing? Why job are we seeing? The hidden structure of the world or the hidden hopes we bring to it? Perhaps at times it is impossible to separate the two. What if the final moment of a human life left behind a measurable trace? That question once drew doctors, inventors, and mystics toward one of the most unsettling devices ever imagined. A scale designed not to weigh the body, but whatever might depart from it. The scene feels almost unbearably still. A patient lies in bed. Nearby, a carefully calibrated apparatus waits beneath the frame, sensitive to the smallest change in mass. The air is quiet except for breathing, for the soft mechanical patience of a machine prepared to witness something no instrument had ever truly been asked to witness before. The hope was simple and immense at once. If something leaves at death, perhaps it leaves weight behind. The results, as history remembers them, were uncertain, disputed, and impossible to cleanly reproduce. A few abrupt changes were reported. Other measurements revealed nothing conclusive at all. Physiologists raised practical objections. Bodies release heat, air, moisture. Muscles relax. Fluids shift. The dying process is not a single instant, but a passage, and passages are difficult to measure with the precision we crave. Even so, the story endured. It endured because the experiment touched a fear deeper than mortality itself, the fear that death might be either too material or not material enough. We want to know whether a person is only chemistry, and we want at the same time to believe that love, memory, and consciousness cannot simply vanish into silence. A scale, with its cold authority, seemed to promise an answer from the world of numbers. But perhaps that is why the experiment still lingers in cultural memory. Not because it proved anything, but because it revealed the limits of proof when placed beside grief. Some questions enter the laboratory carrying more than curiosity. They carry longing, and longing can make even the smallest measurement feel like a message. So the scale remains less as evidence than as symbol. It reminds us that when human beings try to weigh the invisible, we are often measuring our own need to believe that a life is more than matter, even when matter is all our instruments can hold. Can a machine hear what grief cannot let go of? In the middle decades of the 20th century, when radio static filled homes with invisible weather, some listeners began to wonder whether the noise between stations was truly empty. They turned dials slowly through the hiss, waiting for fragments of language to rise from the turbulence, like voices across deep water. The equipment was often simple: tape recorders, microphones, shortwave radios, improvised circuits assembled on kitchen tables or in private studios. Yet the atmosphere around these experiments felt almost sacred. A question would be spoken into the room. Silence would follow. Later on playback, a faint reply seemed to emerge from the grain of sound. Sometimes it was only a syllable, sometimes a name, sometimes a phrase so fragile it seemed to exist only because someone desperately wanted it to. Skeptics heard what they expected to hear: interference, pattern seeking, misheard audio shaped by suggestion. They were not wrong to be cautious. The human brain is an exquisite maker of meaning, and static is generous material for imagination. But those who believed in the recordings were not always foolish or credulous. Many were ordinary people confronting absence, using the newest technologies of their era to negotiate with an ancient human wound. That may be why these experiments continue to resonate. They were never just about ghosts or proof or hidden frequencies drifting at the edge of science. They were about the unbearable quiet that follows loss. Technology, for a moment, offered a ritual for crossing it. A machine could be switched on. A question could be asked. Hope, however faint, could be heard in return. And perhaps that is the real significance of those whispered recordings. They reveal how quickly our inventions become vessels for longing. We build devices to store sound, transmit speech, and reduce distance. Then one day we ask them to bridge the oldest distance of all. When they fail, they teach us caution. When they seem to answer, they teach us something stranger: how deeply human beings need the world to speak back. What if memory itself could be photographed? Not just the face of a person or the outline of a landscape, but the faint residue of emotion left behind in a room, an object, a moment too intense to disappear cleanly. That idea gave rise to some of the most curious experiments of the last century, when researchers and dreamers alike wondered whether the mind might leave traces in matter. A sealed envelope was held between careful fingers. A watch, long worn by someone now gone, was placed on a table beneath a lamp. A house with a troubled history was entered not as a home, but as if it were a recording medium. Again and again, people asked whether human experience might impress itself upon the physical world the way light marks film or sound marks tape. If so, perhaps certain individuals or certain machines could recover those impressions. The attempts took many forms: sensitive plates, altered cameras, improvised sensors. Often there was very little that could satisfy conventional science. Results were inconsistent, images were vague, interpretations multiplied faster than evidence. Yet the underlying idea persisted because it touched something profoundly modern: the fear that our lives vanish too completely, and the hope that nothing deeply felt is ever truly lost. In a way, every archive is built on that hope. We keep letters, photographs, recordings, and now digital shadows because we cannot bear the full speed of forgetting. These stranger inventions simply extended the same instinct into more uncertain territory. They suggested that memory might not belong only to the mind, but might cling to the world itself, folded into walls, metals, rooms, and gestures. Whether those experiments uncovered anything real is still open to doubt, but the question they raised remains beautifully difficult. If places can remember us, what responsibilities do we carry through them? And if objects hold no memory at all, why do they still feel so heavy with the lives that touch them? Sometimes the line between evidence and remembrance is not a line at all, but a quiet blur we spend our whole lives trying to read. Could the body know what the conscious mind had not yet understood? That possibility animated a series of unusual experiments in which wires, dials, and sensors were used not merely to monitor health, but to test whether human beings might register hidden truths before they could explain them. Imagine the setting: a plain room, a chair, a subject seated calmly while electrodes rest against the skin. On the table lies a sequence of images, symbols, or sealed targets. The person is asked to guess, to react, to choose. Nothing dramatic appears to happen. Yet the instruments suggest tiny fluctuations before the conscious answer arrives, as if the body had leaned toward knowledge first and the mind followed after, slower and more uncertain. Researchers approached these moments from different directions. Some saw only the familiar language of stress, anticipation, and involuntary response. Others wondered whether the nervous system was more porous than anyone had assumed, subtly sensitive to signals too faint or complex for ordinary awareness. The results remained controversial, difficult to replicate in a way that satisfied everyone and always vulnerable to interpretation. Still, the idea refused to vanish. It refused to vanish because it spoke to an experience many people already knew in private: a hesitation before bad news, a sudden unease in a quiet place, the inexplicable certainty that something is wrong or right before evidence arrives. Modern life teaches us to distrust such moments, to call them coincidence or projection. But these experiments suggested that intuition might be less mystical than it appears, rooted in patterns the body can detect even when language cannot yet catch up. That possibility carries both wonder and humility. It means we may be more perceptive than we realize, but also less transparent to ourselves than we imagine. We do not fully know how we know. So these devices, whether flawed or ahead of their time, asked a question that still matters. If truth sometimes reaches the body before it reaches the mind, then what other forms of knowledge move quietly within us, waiting for us to become still enough to notice? What if sound could reveal a world the eye was never meant to enter? Long before digital imaging mapped the hidden interior of the body with astonishing precision, there were quieter, stranger moments when inventors began to suspect that vibration itself might be a form of sight. In dim laboratories and hospital corridors, early listening devices pressed against bone, chest, metal, and stone. A doctor leaned close to a crude instrument and heard the murmur of a failing heart. An engineer tapped a structure and listened for weakness buried inside it. A researcher sent waves through tissue and measured their return, sensing that echoes might carry pictures if only the language of them could be understood. The invisible was no longer silent, it was resonant. This was not mystery in the supernatural sense. It was mystery of another kind. The realization that reality is layered with signals we move through every day without noticing. Beneath the surface of things, patterns were always traveling. The body was full of rhythms. The earth itself hummed with pressure and fracture. Machines, walls, and even empty rooms answered when spoken to in the right frequency. To listen carefully was to discover that nothing was ever entirely still. And yet even this deeply scientific frontier carried something almost poetic. Sound is intimate. It arrives through air and matter, touches us before we can hold it, then disappears. To use it as a tool of revelation was to trust what could not be seen to illuminate what could. That required a subtle shift in human confidence. Vision had long ruled our definition of evidence. Now vibration asked to share the throne. What followed would transform medicine, engineering, and the ways we understand the hidden architecture of life. But at the beginning, there was only a simple, almost ancient intuition that the world speaks in more ways than one. And perhaps wisdom begins when we stop insisting that truth must always appear in light and allow it sometimes to arrive as an echo. What if the sky was never empty, only unread? For generations, people looked upward and saw distance, weather, stars, and silence. Then came the instruments that taught us to listen differently. Radio receivers, signal arrays, and patient lengths of wire stretched into the air like questions, waiting for the universe to answer in frequencies no human ear could hear. At first, the sounds seemed almost absurd in their plainness. Hisses, pulses, repeating bursts, noise, everywhere noise. Yet hidden within that static were signatures of storms beyond the horizon. The crackle of solar activity, the rhythm of distant transmissions, and the unmistakable evidence that space was not a void, but a field of conversation. The unseen had not been absent. We had simply lacked the language to recognize it. This changed more than science. It changed the emotional scale of being human. To discover that invisible waves were crossing the planet and spilling through the heavens meant that reality was far denser than our senses suggested. Messages moved around us constantly. Energy leapt between bodies and machines, between earth and sky, between one age of civilization and the next. The world became less like a solid stage and more like an ocean of signals, most of them passing through us unnoticed. And with that revelation came an older, more haunting thought. If our tools could uncover so much hidden order in the air above us, what else might exist just beyond the limits of our current perception? The question inspired engineers, astronomers, and dreamers alike. Some pursued disciplined observation, others wandered into speculation. Both were responding to the same shock, the realization that human perception is not a measure of reality, only a narrow window into it. That may be why these instruments still feel quietly profound. They did not merely extend our reach. They humbled us. They reminded us that the universe had been speaking long before we learned to listen, and that much of wisdom may begin with admitting how much has always surrounded us in silence. What if images were never only about what stood in front of the lens? As photography matured, some inventors and experimenters became fascinated by a stranger possibility. That cameras might capture not just surfaces, but presences, tensions, and hidden layers of a moment that ordinary sight passed over too quickly. The settings were often ordinary enough to make the results feel more unsettling. A family portrait in a still parlor, a laboratory subject seated against a blank wall, a landscape photograph twice under slightly altered conditions. Then, in the developed image, something appeared that no one remembered seeing at the time. A misted outline, an improbable form, an extra texture of light hanging in the frame like memory refusing to leave. There were many reasons such effects could occur. Long exposures invited movement to linger. Double impressions confused time within a single plate. Dust, chemical flaws, reflections, and processing accidents created illusions persuasive enough to stir even a skeptical mind. Yet the emotional force of these images did not come only from deception. It came from the unsettling truth that cameras already do alter reality. They crop it, delay it, flatten it, preserve it, and sometimes reveal details the eye missed in passing. In that sense, these mysterious photographs touched a deeper issue than whether any one image was genuine. They exposed the fragile contract between seeing and believing. We tend to trust pictures because they feel impartial, as if the machine itself cannot yearn or nor imagine. But every image is shaped by conditions, by tools, by timing, by the quiet decisions of the person behind the lens. Even mechanical vision carries human longing inside it. Perhaps that is why such photographs still linger in the cultural imagination. They remind us that images do not merely record the world. They also record our hunger to find meaning within it. And once a picture suggests there may be more in a scene than first appeared, it leaves us with a difficult, enduring question. How much of reality is hidden from us until some accident of light teaches us to see differently? What if the most unsettling inventions were not the ones that discovered something new, but the ones that suggested time itself might not move as neatly as we pretend? In scattered experiments across the last century, there were moments when people believed they had built devices capable of detecting events before they happened, or of preserving traces from moments not yet fully arrived. The setups were usually modest, a sensor linked to a random signal generator, a timing circuit watching for anomalies, a subject seated before a screen, while instruments measured responses to images selected only afterward. The claim, the claim when it appeared that was always delicate and hard to hold. The body seemed to react before the event. The machine appeared to tremble before the change, as if cause and effect had briefly loosened their order. Such findings made many scientists uneasy, and for good reason. Timing errors, hidden variables, selection bias, and the subtle pressure of expectation can turn coincidence into apparent revelation. Careful inquiry demands restraint, especially when a result flatters our appetite for the extraordinary. And yet these experiments would not entirely disappear because they touched something uncomfortably familiar. Most people know the feeling of anticipation that seems too precise, the dream that echoes a later moment, the sense that the future sometimes brushes against us before it arrives. Whether those experiences reveal anything beyond ordinary cognition remains uncertain, but uncertainty does not make the question trivial. It may be that the mind is better at absorbing patterns than we understand. It may be that memory and prediction are more closely braided than they appear. Or it may simply be that human beings are narrative creatures, always arranging time into forms we can bear. Still, the fascination remains. We live as though time is a straight corridor, yet our inner lives rarely feel that way. Regret pulls backward, hope leans ahead, memory interrupts the present, expectation changes what we notice. If certain inventions seem to blur those boundaries, perhaps what they truly revealed was not a crack in time itself, but the mysterious way consciousness moves through it, never entirely confined to now. What happens when an invention survives, not through proof, but through persistence? By the time many of these devices had faded from serious institutions, they had already entered another kind of life. They moved into private collections, fringe journals, forgotten patents, documentaries, whispered recollections, and family stories told with equal parts skepticism and reverence. The laboratory door closed, but the cultural memory remained ajar. That endurance matters. A machine does not need to be universally accepted to leave a mark on human thought. Sometimes its influence comes from the questions it forces us to keep asking. A disputed photograph can still alter how we think about evidence. A failed experiment can still reveal what an era feared losing. Even a flawed invention can become a mirror, reflecting the emotional and philosophical needs of the people who built it. In that sense, these devices belong to a long tradition of threshold objects. Telescopes did not only expand astronomy, they changed humanity's sense of place. Recordings did not only preserve sound, they transformed memory and mourning. In the same way, stranger inventions, even the doubtful ones, asked whether our senses were ever enough. They suggested that knowledge might have edges, and that beyond those edges lie not only answers, but new forms of humility. There is something poignant in the pattern. Again and again, the inventors were not chasing spectacle for its own sake. Many were trying to reconcile the measurable with the meaningful. They wanted a world in which wonder could survive examination. They hoped machinery might help translate the unsayable into signals, weights, images, or tones. And when that translation failed, it still revealed how deeply we resist the idea that reality should be smaller than our experience of it. So these inventions endure as unfinished sentences in the history of curiosity. They remind us that being wrong is not always the opposite of being sincere, and that the search for truth often passes through error, longing, and metaphor before it reaches clarity. Perhaps what lasts is not the claim itself, but the human courage required to ask it. What if the true legacy of these inventions lies not in what they proved, but in how they changed the questions we are willing to ask? Over time, many ideas once dismissed as fantasy have been absorbed into ordinary science, though often in altered form. What began as dream, metaphor, or failed experiment sometimes returned later with better tools, clearer methods, and a language strong enough to separate insight from illusion. That is one of the quiet patterns in the history of discovery. Human beings often sense possibilities before they can verify them. We imagine invisible fields before we can map them precisely. We suspect hidden structures before we can visualize them. We feel that the body, the mind, and the world are connected by signals too subtle for current instruments, and sometimes, years later, the instruments catch up. Not always, but often enough to keep humility alive. This does not mean every extraordinary claim deserves belief. It means dismissal should be as careful as belief itself. There is wisdom in skepticism when it protects us from error, but there is also wisdom in curiosity when it protects us from becoming too certain of our limits. Between those two virtues, civilization advances, not in a straight line, but through argument, correction, wonder, and revision. The most valuable inventions may therefore be the ones that fail usefully. They disturb settled assumptions. They widen the imagination of a field. They leave behind fragments that later generations revisit with steadier hands. Even when the original theory dissolves, the deeper impulse may survive. The desire to understand what lies just beyond the visible edge of explanation. And so, these strange devices, whether misguided, premature, or quietly visionary, ask something enduring of us. Can we remain disciplined without becoming closed? Can we honor evidence without shrinking mystery into something trivial? Progress depends on both instincts. To know more, we must measure carefully. But to discover what is worth measuring, we must first allow ourselves to wonder. What remains after the instruments fall silent? Not the diagrams, not the claims alone, not even the arguments that once surrounded them. What remains is a portrait of humanity standing at the threshold of its own ignorance, refusing with remarkable tenderness to accept that the visible world is the whole of the world. By this point in our journey, the pattern is unmistakable. A device is built, a boundary is tested, a result appears uncertain but provocative. Debate follows. Some see error, others see revelation. And beneath both reactions lies the same confession. We are creatures trying to make peace with mystery while carrying tools designed for certainty. That tension has shaped nearly every age of inquiry. There is no shame in that tension. In fact, it may be one of our finest qualities. We do not stop asking difficult questions simply because they are difficult. We ask whether consciousness can be measured, whether memory leaves traces, whether absence can speak, whether time can bend, whether life extends beyond the categories we have made to describe it. Even when the answers remain incomplete, the asking itself enlarges us. These inventions, strange as some of them were, belong to that enlargement. They reveal not only technical ambition, but emotional bravery. To test such ideas is to risk ridicule, disappointment, and ambiguity. Yet without people willing to endure those things, much of what we now call knowledge would never have entered the world. Every discipline has, somewhere in its ancestry, an experiment that looked improbable before it looked inevitable. So perhaps the unseen is not merely a realm beyond perception. Perhaps it is also the part of truth that requires patience, humility, and generations of revision before it can be welcomed into understanding. If that is so, then the real lesson of these forgotten inventions is not that the world is haunted by secrets. It is that human beings are, and always have been, illuminated by the desire to seek them. In the end, perhaps the story was never really about forbidden inventions at all. It was about the human condition. Our refusal to let the world become smaller than our questions. Each device we have encountered, whether elegant, flawed, or misunderstood, was built from the same ancient impulse that first led our ancestors to map the stars, tend a fire, or leave a handprint on stone. We are a species forever reaching past the edge of certainty. Some of the machines failed, some misled. Some may have revealed only the mechanics of error, the ease with which hope can shape perception. But even that has meaning. To study our mistakes is also to study ourselves. It shows us what we hunger for, what we grieve, what we fear losing to silence. In every attempt to detect the invisible, there was also an attempt to defend wonder from despair. And still, the world remains gloriously unfinished. Science continues to refine its methods, to correct its excesses, to turn speculation into testable form. That discipline matters. Without it, mystery becomes noise. But without mystery, discipline risks becoming sterile, forgetting that every instrument begins as an act of imagination. The two need each other more than we often admit. Curiosity gives science its horizon. Science gives curiosity its honesty. So when we look back on these strange and half-forgotten experiments, we do not need to treat them as prophecy or fraud. We can see them more humanely than that. They were expressions of a deep and recurring truth, that people long not only to survive in the world, but to understand their place within it, to ask where life begins, where consciousness lingers, what memory leaves behind, and whether reality extends beyond the narrow beam of the senses. Those questions remain. They will outlive every machine that tried to answer them. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be, because the future of knowledge may depend less on finding a final certainty than on preserving the courage to keep looking into the dark and calling it not emptiness, but possibility.